Good evening, everyone. This is Dr. Heidi Marshall with the Online Writing Center. We're going to get started in just about 1 minute while we wait for a couple more folks to join. All right, hello and welcome again. My name is Dr. Heidi Marshall. I'm with the Online Writing Center, and I appreciate you joining this evening for our webinar on what is plagiarism and how do I know if I've done it. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started tonight. Just to let you know, this session is being recorded. The session, as well as a transcript and slides, are available on the Online Writing Center website. A few days following the session, if you registered, you will also receive a link to the recording of the session automatically within 24 hours of the session ending this evening. So I encourage you to sit back and just enjoy the presentation. Certainly take notes. We know that taking notes live engages your learning, helps you recall information. So I do encourage you to take notes, but don't feel like you need to write everything down because again, you will have access to this content after the fact. Okay, so tonight's session is broken out into 3 parts. First, we're going to talk about why should I care, right? Why is there so much emphasis placed on plagiarism? Why should I care about things like plagiarism checkers in my classroom, how to avoid plagiarism? Then we're going to talk a little bit about understanding what plagiarism is and what constitutes plagiarism. This is something that is specific to, in some regards, specific to the Chicago School, definitely specific to the environment of higher education that we are in. So you are here, you're in a graduate school, what's called a Western educational institution. And so plagiarism has a very specific definition. There's also very specific laws regarding intellectual property and what you can and cannot recycle and use in your work. And then I will end tonight with some tips on how to avoid plagiarism. I do encourage you to ask questions throughout. So I have the question and answer box open on my screen. I'll do my best to answer questions as they come in. If I don't see your question, that's right away, that's okay. You can also use the raise hand feature. We have a relatively small group here this evening, so I might even invite you to take yourself off mute and you can ask your question aloud. So let's talk a little bit about why we should care about what plagiarism is, what it means to hold up to the standards of academic integrity. First, before we can get into that conversation, we really need to understand what it is we are doing as students in higher education, particularly if you are a doctoral student here at the Chicago School and you are getting to the point in your degree program where you're thinking about writing that dissertation, or perhaps you are thinking about collaborating with a classmate or a faculty member on publication. What does that mean? As an academic, which is what you are, you're a student here at the Chicago School. We call professional students scholar practitioners. So that means that you are both engaged in the work of being a student and being a scholar, as well as the work of being a professional. So you are out in the world practicing what you are learning in your classrooms by and large. Academics also include educators, so those are your faculty and your academic staff, really anyone who's engaged in higher education and research. So there is this body of people who are engaged in what we call the academic conversation. And as a student, you are now an academic, but you are also now part of that academic conversation. And that academic conversation has both some written and some unwritten rules about how to engage. So how do we engage? Really at the very basic level, sort of the lowest level. So this is the most informal level, right? We talk with one another. Hopefully, again, we'll do that in person within and across higher education institutions. So this might be if you're an on-ground student, you're passing each other in the hallway and you're saying hello, or you're talking informally about a class or a course assignment, or perhaps in your online discussion boards for those of you who are online students, that you're chatting or you're emailing one another. So these are sort of the lower stakes form of conversation that happens within academia. One step up from that is engaging in electronic discussion boards and forums that you're writing for a grade. So now you're being assessed on your writing in that particular capacity. The next step up from that is course assignments, meetings, presenting. So somewhere where you have to have a much more formal presence, and also where you are conveying the voice of being the expert, of being the one who holds the knowledge, that you have to convey an objective tone in your writing, and you have to make sure that you're building your credibility in the way in which you communicate. A step up from that is exchanging written work. So again, as you get higher up into your degree program, you're going to be submitting research manuscripts of your own original research to your faculty, to outside readers, to a committee to read and receive feedback. You might be asked by a classmate to read some of their work, so you're exchanging formal written work. And then finally, when you do get to that place where you are ready to engage more fully in the academic conversation through publication. So you will submit manuscripts for publication. Part of that is the peer review process. So you are going to have a panel of colleagues around the world who might read your article, provide feedback, and be fairly critical in it. So throughout all of these levels of communication in the academic world, you need to make sure that you are maintaining the highest levels of what we call honesty and credibility, because that is the foundation of the academic conversation. And as a novice researcher, so somebody who's maybe not quite yet out in the world publishing work, what your role here as a scholar practitioner is to build that foundation to join the conversation. So really, you're building your own credibility during your degree program here. And to remember that part of that credibility is all about honesty and credit. That is the heart of our academic conversation. So the academic conversation, it's a conversation born of ideas from original research, right? So this original research, this might be something, again, on that lower tier of communication. This could be your own library research, right? So you've been tasked perhaps with identifying 5 to 10 articles, or perhaps those articles are provided for you in your classroom. You need to read them, you need to critically analyze them, you need to synthesize them into a research paper. But those become your own ideas, right? Even when you're paraphrasing from other folks, even when you are summarizing somebody else's words, the way you put that paper together, that is your own research. Those are your own ideas that you end up coming up with. So your conclusion at the end of that paper, that is your own idea. And if you think about all of the ideas that you're reading, right, think about those. Those are ideas that belong to other people. They did the research, they did the work to come up with those ideas. And those ideas are intellectual property. So they do become, much like if you purchase a car, that becomes your property. When you have original research and you do the work, that becomes your own intellectual property. So that means that the words that you read, what you're reading in articles, books, on websites, those are all representations of other people's ideas, and thus representations of their own intellectual property. Okay, so we know that these ideas, they belong to somebody else, but it's necessary for us to use these ideas. How else do we join this academic conversation if it's not by showing that we've done our due diligence, that we've read all of the current literature in our particular field and we know what we're talking about, right? So we have to draw upon those ideas from those who came before us. Where plagiarism and academic integrity come into play is when we fail to give attribution or fail to credit those ideas to the people who originally produced them. So we fail to say this idea belongs to so-and-so. Okay, and that is what constitutes plagiarism. It is considered, and again, this is regional, this is specific to to Western education here in the United States. This isn't true everywhere, but here in the United States, it is considered plagiarism to use somebody else's ideas, to use their words without giving attribution, without citing that person, because it is their intellectual property. So that's the rationale behind why we go through understanding what APA citation looks like, why we have to use it, why your instructors might be incredibly strict about it. Okay, but what does it actually look like? Because on the outset, we can say, well, of course, I'm not copying and pasting other people's ideas. I don't think there's really, I have never, I mean, I've worked in higher education, teaching graduate school for almost 15 years, since 2007. So when we think about plagiarism, I don't know that I've ever encountered a student who's intentionally took somebody else's work and tried to put it forth as their own, right? And with a really sort of malicious intent to try to cheat. You know, we know that, you know, as a student, why on earth would you risk that? It really rarely ever happens. However, that doesn't mean that plagiarism is non-existent, because it can happen in ways that students don't actually understand is plagiarism. So that's really what I'm trying to hone in on tonight, is helping you understand that we know that students aren't out to cheat intentionally. Most students are not out to cheat intentionally. However, can still be flagged for it because they don't understand all that might encompass plagiarism. So what is plagiarism? This is the Chicago School definition. We don't necessarily have to read all of it here, but I do want you to know that it exists. It's in your student handbook. You know, it includes obviously copying the work of another person. Okay. It also includes producing your own original work for each class. So you cannot reuse or recycle work from one class to another unless you have very specific permission to do so. But it also is following the rules that govern source attribution. So if you see this, failure to properly follow appropriate rules governing source attribution can be construed to be plagiarism. So this is where most students tend to run into trouble, right? Is that they're not properly following those rules of source attribution. Again, this is in your student handbook. If you have not read through the academic integrity policies, I do recommend you do so. Okay, so what counts as plagiarism? We know directly quoting, summarizing, or paraphrasing without attribution. Okay, even when it's unintentional. Copying answers from an online repository. I'm going to bring up a few examples of that later. Copying answers from an online quiz help site or study guide. So if you are on the internet and you're trying to find study guides for your course, I know that there's a lot of them out there. I know a lot of people put the work that they do out on the internet for other people to use, but you need to know that if you're using that work, you're committing an academic integrity violation. Using course material that was originally produced by someone else. So even if you've paid for it, right? So you have permission, that person, by putting their work out on the internet, has given you permission to use it, but that doesn't mean you get to use it without some consequence. Hiring a company that claims to write original papers for you. I know there's a number of those out there as well. If you present that paper as your own work, that is plagiarism because it's not your own work. You didn't write that paper. Pirating assignments off the internet, these are all related, and resubmitting an assignment from a previous course, and false or inaccurate attribution. Okay, this is a fairly exhaustive list, right? There might be other instances that pop up here and there, but by and large, this is what constitutes plagiarism and the major academic integrity violations, particularly in the history of the Chicago School, what we have seen occur here. And again, it's rarely intentional, right? It's just the fact that students didn't necessarily understand that these were against the rules. So how is plagiarism detected? How do we even know? And I'll be very honest that sometimes we don't, right? So there are a lot of these sites that it's very difficult to prove that a student has copied somebody else's work or has borrowed without attribution. Our primary source is using Turnitin. As you know, in your classrooms, most of your assignments are going through Turnitin. as you submit them. But then also, it's the act of what I call, it's called suspicion and investigation, right? So this is if I'm reading a paper from a student and I'm very familiar with that student's writing style, and I chance upon a paragraph that's suddenly in a very different style, or perhaps the student has forgot to reformat the copy paste, and so it's in a different font, or it's in a web-based font versus a desktop application font, right? That's pretty easy way to so, you know, a red flag is going to go up and I'm going to say, I'm a little suspicious about this. We might enter that into Google, right? It's I'm going to take a sentence of your paper, I'm going to put it into my Google search engine, I'm going to see what pops up. Sometimes it's comparing assignments, right? So I say, wow, that sounds really familiar. It seems like I just read that same thing from a student whose paper I graded 10 minutes ago. Or even reaching out to the student and asking for additional evidence, saying, hey, some of these suspicions were raised in me as I was reading your paper, and I'd like you to tell me more about how you went about writing this paper. And so really tasking students with being able to show that it's original work. That's just a few ways, but I'm going to dive into some more specific examples here. So turn it in. And you feel free to use the chat. I'd be curious to know of those of you in attendance this evening, how many of you have had an assignment that came back with a turn it in percentage that was 20% or higher? Okay, so Adrian said yes, one paper only. So I went at 100%. So Ricardo, I'm actually going to talk about why that might be. That's good. So a couple things to remember about that percentage that you see is it's not a score. So you don't want to call it your similarity score. It's not a score. And it's not actually an indicator of plagiarism. Okay, so that percentage, generally it means that the Turnitin tool has found matching text strings. So what it's doing is looking for strings of text, so strings of words. It's usually 3 or more words in a row that match the same 3 or more words in a row in some other document. Okay, a published document. And Turnitin is not an exhaustive database. So while it does check almost most things that are readily accessible and published, and including formally submitted student papers, it doesn't check out everything, right? Obviously, it's not checking books that aren't ebooks. It's not able to check everything. So it's matching again for text strings that match. So that's what that percentage means. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you've committed plagiarism. I know that in a lot of classes here, faculty sort of have a benchmark saying if it's 20% or more, that's when they are going to really dig in and say, what's happening here? I'd say, I think a student can come up with 2% on a similarity report and have more egregious plagiarism than a student who has 56%. And I'll show you why. So it's really important, what I'm getting at, it's really important to understand what that percentage means and to dive in and to look at it. So don't freak out if you have a relatively high percentage. What you need to do is open that report and figure out what's going on. Okay, so few examples of what you might see when you open that report. Here is a couple paragraphs. You notice Turnitin highlights, as you know, it highlights passages where that, again, it's just all it's done is look for that string of text that matches exactly strings of text in other documents. It'll give you a little number. So that number corresponds to the source where Turnitin found this. All right, and in this particular example, the student was looking at 52%. And as you can see, it's not that 52% of the student's paper was copy and pasted from another source. That's almost never the case. It's that multiple smaller strings of text show up in other places. So you're seeing 3%, 3%, 3% here. So what does that mean? In this instance, this is plagiarism. This is plagiarism because if you see, this is word for word text. So look at this entire sentence. Turnitin has identified there's entire sentences that are copied. Now the student does have a citation, right? So I would say, even though this is plagiarism, this was unintentional. This student did their best. They were citing their sources. However, what the student has failed to do is put quotation marks around those direct quotes. So anytime you have word for word text from another source, even if you cite it, you still have to put it in quotation marks, right? Because if you don't, then the implication is that you've put it in your own words, but that's just not the case. And so that is considered plagiarism, even if you have those citations there. So this is a very common example, and this is a really easy fix. I also recommend, if you are getting high percentages, before, almost always you'll have an opportunity to check that percentage before you submit your assignment for a grade. So if you are seeing that percentage is higher than you'd like it to be and you're not sure why, in the Writing Center, we work with students on this. So you are welcome to send us your paper and your Turnitin report, and ask for help in figuring out, how do I get that percentage down? How do I make sure Turnitin isn't flagging what it shouldn't be flagging, or correcting what I need to correct? So another example, here. So again, this is an example where the Turnitin percentage, the similarity index was 27%. And if you notice, it's just multiple strings of 1% matches. So these are very small matches, only it happened 27 times. So that's where the 27% came. And here, what's happening, again, unintentional, it is plagiarism, but the quotation marks are placed incorrectly and there is not a citation. So there are quotation marks, but there's actually no APA citation. So this is sort of the opposite of what we just saw, right, where there was citation, no quotation marks, is that you need to make sure, if you remember back to what the Chicago school policy says, is that inaccurate or false attribution constitutes plagiarism. So in this case, it is inaccurate. It's not following the conventions of APA style. And so this would be considered plagiarism. Now here's something that happens a lot, is that, remember, Turnitin is just looking for strings of text that is similar to strings of text in other sources. And sometimes that can be really long titles or very common phrases. Okay, so here's another example, 27%, right? So it's over that threshold of 20% that a lot of our instructors look for. And in this case, these are very common phrases, right? So mass incarceration in the United States. If you can think about how many publications probably have that phrase in it, so many. The war on drugs. The war on drugs in the United States, right? Think about how many places that's going to turn up. So Turnitin, unfortunately, it's not perfect and often is going to flag very common phrases like this. This is not plagiarism, right? So this is why, if you do, for example, if you have an instructor who says, well, your index, your percentage came back too high, and you go into your paper and you say, hey, I don't really think this is plagiarism. I think that Turnitin is falsely flagging common phrases, even things like post-traumatic stress disorder, that can be flagged, right? So you do want to go in, and it's okay to advocate for yourself and to say to your instructor, listen, I don't agree that this is plagiarism, that this should be considered part of that percentage, that similarity index. That said, if you are somebody who's relying on these very common phrases or colloquial phrasing, a way around this is to just change up your wording, right? Consider how you can revise for more original thought. Think about how you can vary your syntax so that you're not repeating these common phrases over and over in your work. Again, that's somewhere where the Writing Center can come and help you if this is something that you're encountering. Self-plagiarism. So Ricardo, this is where we see a very high percentage, if not 100, that it's often very high percent, and it says that it was previously submitted to the Chicago school. So as I mentioned, the policy of the Chicago school is that you need to be reproducing original work in all of your classes, that you cannot what's called text recycle. So you can't use one assignment from a previous class in a current class unless you have received permission to do so. Okay. So if this does happen, you can, few things to ask yourself, whether or not it's plagiarism, because instructors will almost always come back and tell you to redo this assignment. Is it your own work from a previous class? So again, if so, did you have permission? Or is the assignment iterative in nature? So for example, I teach English 200 here at the Chicago School for our BA students. And in that class, they write the same paper during the entire term. And so each week, they are turning in text that they had already turned in. And so their percentages, those percentages tend to be a little higher. But as the instructor, I just know that. I know that that's not flagging anything that I need to be concerned about. Or perhaps, did you inadvertently copy and paste the assignment instructions into your paper? That might cause your percentage to go high, right? If that's something that multiple other students have done before. Or perhaps, the assignment is just lends itself to having high similarity, right? If your instructor is giving you a template and it has questions in it and you're supposed to respond to those questions, right? So then half the paper perhaps is the questions that every other student has in their paper. So these are just a few things. Ask yourself things that your instructor should also be asking themselves about what might be causing that percentage to be so high. But if you did, if you need to admit, hey, yeah, I recycled too much of my paper from a previous class or from a previous assignment, you should always, I think, by and large, every instructor at the Chicago school wants to see you succeed. So if it comes up, and we had a few students admit that this has happened, right? If you just own up to it, even if it was unintentional, just say, I understand. I'd like the opportunity to redo the assignment. You will be given that opportunity, right? We want to see this as a learning opportunity for students. It's not meant to be punitive. Because like I mentioned, we know that this is almost never intentional. Students aren't out to cheat. They want to do well. They want to thrive here. And so most of the time, your instructors are here to help you do that. So those are my Turnitin examples. I mentioned though that Turnitin, it isn't perfect. It doesn't catch much of what actual plagiarism is. Okay, so this is where perhaps we do see some inkling of intention to cheat. And that intention might be sparked because we're very busy. If you're an online student here, our accelerated degree program can be really stressful. You have 7 weeks to complete a class, which means you have to be working almost every day on your discussion posts, your course assignments, your course readings. There's very little margin for error or for falling behind. And sometimes that can create anxiety. Sometimes that can produce situations where we feel like, I just need a quick answer. I just need to be able to do this fast. And this is where we can now run into some problems. So what we call piecemeal paraphrasing. And sometimes this is identifiable with a similarity index. So sometimes Turnitin is going to catch this, but not always. So here's an example. This is somebody who had written a book. This book had won several awards, and then it came out that the person who wrote this book, Craig Wright, had plagiarized his entire PhD thesis. And he had done so by doing what's called piecemeal paraphrasing. So he had taken the work of other people and not just taken their work, their research, had not just taken the results of their research, but had actually taken the written work of other people and had changed it just enough that by and large nobody was really able to identify that it had been plagiarized. But if you look at these two passages here, so this is just an example from the article. In building each decision, so this is the original published in 2004, and building each decision tree model based on different random subsets of the training data set, a random subset of the available variables is used to choose how best to partition the data set in each node. Okay, and then Wright, several years later, writes if you see, it's exactly the same thing. He's just pulled out his thesaurus and done a little wordsmithing. So in the construction of each decision tree model, an individual random subset of the training data set uses a random subset of the presented variables to decide where to partition the data set at each node. Okay, so it is the same content, just tweaked just enough, that tools like Turnitin aren't going to flag it, right? Because there aren't those word strings there. And this is plagiarism. This is fairly egregious plagiarism, right? This demonstrates an intent on the part of the author to not produce their own work. All right, I haven't encountered that at the Chicago school, but it's good to know that it's something you cannot do, and that the consequences of plagiarism vary, right? So if you have a high similarity index and you and your instructor figure out it's because you're not using APA properly, that is one thing. If you have a high similarity index and it turns out you've intentionally copied and pasted somebody else's work, that's an entirely different thing. That's the difference between you having the opportunity to redo an assignment and you being placed on an academic development plan, right? So you want to make sure you know the differences here. So we mentioned that inaccurate or false attribution as a serious academic integrity violation. It's in the handbook, right? So what does false attribution mean? That means when you have, perhaps you put a quote or you paraphrase some information, you have a statistics in your document and you need to cite it, and you do cite it, but perhaps we were just a little bit lazy about this and we didn't go back and identify, hey, was this the correct source? Is this actually the source where I got this information? Or, am I just going to throw a citation in for the sake of having a citation here because I don't think anyone's actually going to go check? So this is false attribution. So in this example, the student is citing this source called announcement, and attributing all of this information to this particular source. But if you read the source itself, it has nothing to do with this information that the student is citing. So this is false attribution. This is not something that Turnitin can check for. So Turnitin is useless in identifying this form of an academic integrity violation. However, your faculty are very resourceful, particularly as you begin to work with faculty who are more specialized, so on your dissertation committee and so forth. Right, so it's, unfortunately, this is something that's fairly easy to do and really hard to catch, but if you are caught, it is a very serious academic integrity violation. I mentioned paid services. I would probably put money on the fact that none of you in attendance here tonight or listening to this recording has ever done this. However, I do feel compelled to call attention to the fact that these do exist. And the reason students get caught up into it and get caught for unintentional plagiarism is that these sites advertise that, hey, you're not committing plagiarism because this is original work, right? We're not copying from anybody. We're not stealing any work. We are paying people to write your papers for you. However, this is definitely not something that Turnitin would be able to identify because it is original work. And generally it's work written by people who know what they're doing, right? But it is an academic integrity violation, and a very severe one, because what you're doing is you're putting your name on work that somebody else produced. Even if you paid them to produce it on your behalf, it still isn't your work. Okay. A few more examples here. And Adrian, I see your question, so I'll pause in just a moment. I might have you ask that question aloud. Okay, so here's an example. So Quizlet, I don't know if any of you have ever used Quizlet or an online quiz or study guide site like this. So what you see here on the screen is the post in question. Okay, this was a quiz, a Canvas quiz that the student was filling out, and this is the student's answer. So the reappearance of previously reinforced BX after its replacement BX was put on extinction, or the scheduled reinforcement lessened, right? Okay, so this is the student's answer to a quiz question. And it raised some suspicion with the instructor. So we went and we just Googled, we just copied and pasted this quiz answer from the student into Google. And we found this. We found a Quizlet flashcard with this exact text, the citation included. So what the student had done was went and copied word for word text from this flashcard and submitted it as their answer. Okay, that might be something that but this, unfortunately, this assignment is not something, quizzes aren't run through Turnitin. So Turnitin wouldn't catch it. If it were run through Turnitin, there's a chance that Turnitin would flag that. Not always, but it is definitely plagiarism, definitely considered cheating. Same with sites like Course Hero. So we know that a lot of folks, they finish, there are Course Hero pages for the Chicago School. You can go in and you can find assignments, you can find quizzes, you can find just about anything, study notes. You can pay for them and download them and use them. However, that is cheating. Okay, if you are caught doing that, you will face repercussions for that. It is an academic integrity violation. Okay, so I'm going to pause. Adrian, do you want to ask your question aloud or retype it again? Because I see you were asking if it was okay to cite, but I'm not sure what you were referring to there. I'm trying to unmute you, Adrian, but I am not able to. I think if you unmute yourself, you should be able to ask.
Oh, okay.
There
Okay,
you go.
can you hear me now? Hi.
Yes. Hi.
Oh, okay. So I guess I was just asking, is it okay? So you was talking about the piecemealing. So would it have been okay if they had cited the source if they
Yes.
did that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Yeah. So if he well, there's a difference between piecemeal and then actual paraphrasing, right? So yes, if he was very intentional about saying, I am mimicking the study from this person. Here's the original source. Here's the citation. Then yes, in that example, that would be fine.
Okay.
But he just didn't. He was passing it off really as his own work. So
Okay. Thank you.
yeah, you're welcome. Okay, so how do we avoid plagiarism? You're going to incorporate the ideas of others. So remember, we have to do that. We do have to put the ideas of others in our papers. You can do that by quoting. So again, you can have that direct quote. However, you have to put it in quotation marks and you have to cite it. You can also summarize it. So summarizing is where you just have that faithful reproduction of the main ideas. You're putting it in your own words. However, because it's not your ideas, you still need to cite it. Or you can do what's called paraphrasing. So this is what we were just talking about. Paraphrasing, it has to go though beyond that piecemeal where you just have a thesaurus out and you're replacing a word here and there, right? It's really, paraphrasing is when you take a very specific idea and you begin to think about it a bit more critically. So not only do you put it in your own words, but you're also sort of analyzing it and synthesizing it with other ideas as you put it into your paper, right? So this is, if you're writing a literature review, this is what you're doing throughout the entire literature review. So you're using the ideas of other people, but you're comparing them, you're contrasting them, you're evaluating them. That's the work of paraphrasing. But again, they're not your own ideas, so they do still need to be cited. You want to cite works that you've read, okay, and ideas that you've incorporated in your writing. So what that means is that if you haven't read a source, you can't cite it, right? So even if you read about that source in another source, you always want to have that primary source citation go. So find that source, right? Also, every source within the paper must appear on the reference list and vice versa. Again, you can only cite the sources you've actually read. So rather than using that secondary source citation, you want to go through and find the primary source. I will say I'm not going to dive into APA citation style too much this evening when we're nearing the end of our time, but also I have in 2 weeks, I have a session on APA style citations specifically. So that's on September 28th, I believe, in the evening. And we'll be diving into citation style much more deeply. In the meantime, you can find lots of APA resources on our website. So remember, regardless of how you convey the ideas of others, you have to cite them. Citation is the source of, is the act of academic integrity. It's how you avoid plagiarism. You need to cite each time you introduce a quote, summary, or paraphrase. You need to recite it when you go back to pulling information from that source, even if you've already cited it in your paragraph. And again, you can learn more about that there, or do attend my webinar on APA style in a couple weeks. It's also our job to maintain our credibility, to make sure we're not committing academic integrity violations, that we are identifying what are called reliable sources, right? So this is part of that act of academic integrity, is making sure that what you're citing is itself credible and it hasn't, taken information from someone else. So we are responsible consumers of information. And we are responsible for incorporating only valid, credible information into the work that we produce ourselves. That's what that means. So part of being the academic and part of being in that academic conversation, remember, it's all about credibility and honesty. So we're going to learn how to check our sources. You want to check for 5 things: checking for accuracy, authority, objectivity, currency, and coverage. And I'll talk about each of these briefly. But before we dive in, let's just talk about sources that are decidedly not credible, right? So unless you have a very specific reason, you would not be citing Quizlet, right? Don't it's not to say you can't use sites like Quizlet to help you practice your knowledge, but when you're incorporating ideas, you should be citing your textbooks. You should be citing the articles, the credible sources that are provided to you. Wikipedia is a good place to start, but it's not a credible or a scholarly source. Your aunt's blog, or anybody's blog for that matter, sites like Course Hero, popular media publications, and social media news. Okay. Yes, these all can be entertaining. They might be good places to start to get ideas about your writing, but they are not credible sources in and of themselves. So how do you identify a credible source? The first one is accuracy, right? So you want to make sure and with each of these, obviously you can't always know. However, to the best of your ability, you want to assess, is the information error-free? Right? Is it independently verifiable? So are there other sources that have come to the same conclusions? Are other people citing the source, right? So is it something that other researchers see as credible? Is the author themselves in the article citing other credible sources? Okay. Also authority. So who wrote it? Is the author easily identifiable, right? Can you go take their name, put it in Google and see that they do work for the university that they say they work for, or the organization they say they work for? Have they published before? Do they belong to professional or academic societies in the field? Again, you might not be able to discern all of this information, but to the best of your ability, can you assess, is the person or the people who wrote this source, are they themselves credible, and do they have authority? Also related to that, and a good way to know, is, are they objective, right? So is the information bias free? It's not trying to advertise or market anything. The author is not devoted to a single political or ideological position. The author considers varying points of view. The document is written for an academic or a professional audience. And the tone and style are free from bias or extreme or emotional language. So you're checking for objectivity. You also want to check for what's called currency. So that is the relevancy of the information in this particular point in time. So do the date of the original document is apparent, making sure. So I always like to reiterate here that the date of publication does not mean the same thing as the date of the research. So often it takes years to get an article published sometimes. So you might have research that you conducted this year, 2021, and not see that published until 2023. So we need to be very careful when we're writing. You don't want to say something like in a research study in 2023, right? Because that study actually took place in 2021. So you want to make sure you're checking, and that, I mean, that's often the case, but that does mean you really need to make sure are the sources I'm using, are they the most current that they can be? Is it up to date, or is it using outdated information, outdated theories, so forth? And related to that is coverage, right? You know, is it providing you both depth and breadth of information? Is it an appropriate level of detail given the specific publication type? Are other relevant aspects covered in the document? How robust is the reference list for this particular article, and so forth? Okay. Remember, the internet is amazing. We can find a lot of information. We have a lot of information coming at us all the time, every day, but that doesn't mean that information is credible and reliable. I strongly recommend that you introduce yourself to the Chicago School Library and the librarians. They are amazing and are really great at helping you. If you're not sure about a particular source and whether it's credible or something you should include, reach out to the librarians. They are a great resource for you. So that is our presentation for this evening. I want to thank you all for coming. I am happy to stay on for a few more minutes and answer any questions that you might have. If you haven't yet used the Writing Center, you can reach us at any time via email. We reply within 24 hours, or submit a paper for review. We have a scheduling system for that. You can access all of this on the Chicago School Community site. Yeah, and again, I am going to end the recording right now, but if you want to stay and ask questions, please feel free. Otherwise, I hope that you have a great evening, and I appreciate you coming. So Ricardo, I'm reading your question. It says, it looks like it shows 83% of the red is coming from a citation on the note. I'm figuring from the same citation, the reference page for APA 7. Are you talking about one of the examples I shared, Ricardo, or you feel free to unmute yourself if you want to ask out loud?
No, I've noticed in mine, usually I get anywhere between like 10, 20%. And then for this one, it popped up 100.
Okay.
And so I noticed looking at these, the bulk of them are like 6%, 5%, but they're all
Yeah.
for the same reference. So
Okay.
there was a graphic, did figure, did note on the bottom. And this note
Yeah.
citation's messed up.
Okay. Yeah. And I will say that Turnitin, it isn't wonderful with that kind of thing, right? With images, with any kind of text that isn't can't be translated to plain text. So yeah, I would dive in. I would just send your instructor a note, and let them know. You can take screenshots of that too. Yeah.
Perfect. This has been helpful. Thank you.
Great. You're welcome. Welcome. Great. Well, thank you all again and have a great evening.